So this is our next lesson on decolonization. So this one is going to be all about the Iranian Revolution and the kind of like modern issues that we're seeing in Iran. This topic is very confusing, so please reach out with questions so that I can try to clarify anything that's going on. So let's start with a quick do now, which will review the apartheid system that we looked at in our lesson on Thursday. So the do now is dealing with this image right here as well as this background information. The text of this political poster describes conditions for Black South Africans under apartheid. You do not need any more really of this text. The photo on the poster shows 13-year-old Hector Pearson, the first student killed by police in the 1976 Soweto uprising, being carried by another student. So when we look at our questions, we're thinking, how are the social conditions depicted in the photograph connected to European colonial rule of South Africa? So how is this apartheid system and this uprising connected back to that colonial rule, connected back to that imperialism? And then again, how are the social conditions depicted in the photograph connected to a law passed by the United States Congress in 1986 that imposed economic sanctions on South Africa? So I want you to be thinking about these types of questions in regards to this poster and in regards to what's going on with apartheid in South Africa at this time. So our objective is to explain the causes and effects of the Iranian Revolution and describe the similarities and differences of life in Iran under the Shah and the Ayatollah. So like I said, this topic can be very confusing, and there is a lot in there. We are going to focus mostly on two people, the Shah and the Ayatollah, um, and we're going to want to make sure that we can understand who these people are and what they believe. So we are going to talk about Westernization and Iran. So obviously, this map that we're looking at is the Middle East. When we are talking about Iran, we are talking about this region actually right over here by the mouse. And we're going to talk about them because they're specifically not Arab. They're actually Persian. So you can see right in here, Iran, which is formerly Persian and Safavid empires, fell under foreign domination of both the British and the Russians in the late 19th century. So this region right in here was partly British and Russian domination before finally gaining independence later on. Now, we're going to see Iran never colonized, but the discovery of oil in the 20th century expanded competition for control among foreigners. So a lot of the Middle East was not formally colonized with full takeovers like we saw in Africa or we saw in Southeast Asia. It's much more similar to what we saw in China, where you had a lot of foreign control and influence, but not like a full takeover. And that really comes with the discovery of oil and the use of oil in terms of you know driving cars and flying planes and how much we needed oil. We want to compare oil to the uses of coal during the Industrial Revolution. So coal really was the resource that is then replaced by oil. Now, this quick video will be in Google Classroom, so you can take a look at it so that you can watch it. It is the opening sequence of the movie Argo, and it does give a really nice overview of the Shah and the rise of the Ayatollah. Highly recommend that you watch. It's only a few minutes. So now let's take a look at Iran itself, okay? In our global scale, you can kind of see that Iran is over here labeled in green. So in 1921, you have the Reza Khan, who seized power through a military coup, and he established the Pahlavi dynasty. So you had this happen, in the 1920s when you saw the end of World War One and decolonization started beginning in the very early stages, and he establishes this idea of a Pahlavi dynasty and calls himself the Shah. When Reza Khan came to power, he modernized Iran's infrastructure. He weakened the power of religious leaders, specifically Islamic religious leaders, and eventually, though, was overthrown in 1941 by Britain and Russia when they really started realizing we want this oil. In 1951, you have Mohammad Mossadegh, who becomes the elected leader of Iran. And here comes that term nationalize again, because his big focus was nationalizing the Iranian oil supplies from foreigners so that they would exclusively benefit the Iranian people. Now, remember, when we think of the term nationalize, we want to think about the fact that now the country itself is going to own that commodity or own that business. We tend to think of nationalizing like some kind of thing as part of a communist government. It doesn't mean that they're always going to be communist, but we tend to kind of associate that term with communism because we saw Stalin and Lenin, and it happened in North Korea and China where they nationalized a lot of these different types of businesses. And his focus was, we're going to nationalize the oil fields, all that money, all that power, all that everything that we're getting from oil is going to go back to Iran, not go into the pockets of the Russians or the British or the Americans. And obviously, that's going to become a huge problem for pretty much everybody else. And Britain and the United States orchestrate a coup that overthrows Mozambique and brings back the Pahlavi Shahs. Now, obviously, this is the next one to come to power. This is not the one in 1921, okay? It's 1953. I believe it's his son. And he is replaced by the Shah, who was backed by Britain and the United States. And this is known as Operation Ajax, where you have these operate, and what they do is they hired the leaders of a bunch of street gangs in Tehran and used them to help to create the impression that the rule of law was totally disintegrated in Iran. They hired a second mob to attack the first mob to give people the impression that there was no police presence and order had completely disintegrated. All right. And President Obama is known as having said, in the Middle East of the Cold War, the United States played a role in overthrow of the democratic elected Iranian government. Because we have to remember is that Mossadegh was democratically elected. He was chosen by the Iranian people to be put into power, and the United States and Britain really ignored that. And this is Shah Reza Pahlavi. We are going to generally refer to him um, as just the Shah, because when we are talking about the Shah, we are talking about Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. We are talking about the one that takes over from the United States and Britain in 1953. So the Shah embraces policy of westernization. He calls it the White Revolution, where he basically westernizes Iran, and he goes through and takes away almost all of their any very religious sightings and organizations, and he focuses entirely on making it a more Western nation. So he creates social welfare system, modern education system, and the word secular courts. We've talked about this word secular many times. We want to make sure that we remember that secular meaning non-religious. So when we're talking about the fact that he created secular courts and secular laws, we're talking about laws that were based not on religion. And before that, they did still have their courts and the law based a lot on the religious aspect, which was Islam. Women were given the right to vote, to work outside the home. Polygamy was banned. Western style dress was encouraged. And you can really see in this image the changes that you had with women very quickly. So in the 1910s, the 1920s, you still had them covered. 1930s, yes, coverings, but more of a hat instead of a scarf. And then you started seeing them walk away from that completely. And then when you have the Pahlavi era ending, you really have that complete go back to complete covering, right? The Shah was viewed as a dictator who used secret police, the Sabak, to crush political opposition. And a lot of people in Iran saw him as a puppet of foreign powers. They saw him as a puppet of the West, that the West was controlling Iran. And this is really what's going to be the reason why it is his downfall, is that they see him as being this puppet of the United States, puppet of the West. We don't want this westernization. We don't want this Western culture. We want what we had before. And this really upset religious conservatives or Islamic fundamentalists. So when we are talking about that term, and that term comes up a lot when we refer to the Iranian Revolution, this idea of Islamic fundamentalism. When you are Islamic fundamentalist, you are very conservative. Think about it as you are going back to the fundamentals of the religion, which means you are, in this case, reading the Quran and you are looking at what the Quran says word for word. And you're saying, we are going to follow this word for word. And a lot of the majority of Iran believed that that was actually the way, that they shouldn't be removing religion from Iran, but they need to go back to the basics and go back to their culture. And this authoritarian rule is going to anger liberals. So you're going to have this big divide in Iran where even though some people did support the things he did, they didn't like that he was very dictatorship. And a lot of the conservatives and the fundamentalists didn't like the way that he was being so secular. In 1979, you have the Iranian Revolution, which was led by elite clerics, and they got rid of the Shah. This was led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And if you take a look at the image that you're seeing on the screen right here, you have the Ayatollah Khomeini in the blue, who seems to be banishing the devil of the Shah. And the Shah is actually going to flee Iran and come to the United States. The Shia cleric Ayatollah Khomeini becomes the supreme leader of Iran, forming a theocracy where religious leaders have secular authority. So at this time, Iran is still one of the only real theocracies out there in the world because they do have ayatollahs who are considered the supreme leader, who focus on the religious aspect. And they're religious leaders and they have secular authority. So they also have authority over the government. They do have prime ministers that are elected, and you can research some more about that. But it's a very convoluted way that they're elected. And they say the dictatorship is gone, bring on the dictatorship. And Ayatollah Khomeini defended Islamic fundamentalism. He emphasized literal translation of Islamic texts, social conservatism, political traditionalism. And this is why in that image before of the women's faces wearing the headscarves or not, you saw them immediately go back to not only just the full headscarf, but more of a niqab style dress where they were not allowed to, drive anymore, have political freedom, or be outside without their husbands. And they're completely going to be covered. So the Khomeini supported jurist guardianship. Clerics have authority to over unfortunate people, but he extended meaning to include the Shia community. Remember when we initially started talking about Islam at the very beginning of the year, we talked about the difference between the Shia and the Shiites and how you have, or the Sunni and the Shia, and how you have those two different groups that while they are members of Islam, they are still very different and do have issues with each other. So Khomeini suppressed all opposition, hoping to purify the country of secular values. So as you see, this is really no different than what we saw with the Shah. There are not a lot of differences in the authoritarian dictatorship style rule between the Shah and the Khomeini. What you saw was a value shift. So what you saw with the Shah was that westernization. We need to be modern. We need to be new. We need to go back and do what the United States and Britain are doing. Whereas in Ayatollah, what you saw was this shift back to this fundamental. We need to go back to our traditions. And this idea between modern and tradition is a problem. It's an enduring issue. The enduring issue of modernization versus traditional, and how do we balance the two? And we see it happen a lot in decolonization countries because these nations have not had time to modernize into a way to figure out how does this balance with what we culturally always have believed and done. In 1979, you also had the takeover of the United States U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran. And you can see this is an image of that takeover. Those that were in the embassy were held hostage for over a year. It was something like 400 some odd days. Um, and this government is extremely anti-West. Western books, music, movies, they're all banned. The U.S. is now referred to as the Great Satan. And this is a big deal because this goes through and goes back and basically is the exact opposite of what the Shah said. The Iran, you want to think of the Iranian Revolution as going from one extreme to a completely other extreme in a very overnight situation. All right. And here are the Iranians who seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They had 52 hostages for 44 days. And this is known as the Iran hostage crisis. Now, this happened because they wanted the Shah returned to Iran so that they could put him up for charges and crimes that he had committed while being the ruler of Iran. and the United States under Jimmy Carter basically refused to give him back. Um, this became a big reason why Jimmy Carter is going to not be elected and why Ronald Reagan is going to be elected. Ronald Reagan was a big one where he was, out there advocating he's going to bring back, the hostages. And, this was seen as a weakness on Jimmy Carter's part for not getting these hostages back. And the hostages are released the day that Ronald Reagan takes his first oath of office. And here you can see that in the New York Times article that is posted right up here. You can also, I remember people telling me that when they watched it, it was like a split screen in the news. On the left side, you saw Ronald Reagan with his hand up taking the oath of office. And on the right side, you saw the hostages, boarding the plane and then disembarking. Iran encourages Muslims and other countries to overthrow secular governments. They encourage them to establish Islamic republics. You want to think of, Iran at this time very similar to what you think of as like, ISIS. This idea of we're going to establish these Islamic republics that are focused on Islam and that are based in the Quran, but not the Quran that you read and you say this is what we're doing. You're focusing on the Quran of this is the most fundamental beliefs. And if it says in here word for word that I can stone my teacher for giving me a bad grade, then I'm allowed to do that. In 1980 to 1988, you had Iran fighting its neighbor Iraq, and this dealt with the Sunni Shia split and the oil supplies along those shared borders. They were fighting over those borders and those conflicts, trying to gain more oil supplies, because obviously whichever countries have the oil supplies, those are going to be the regions that are going to become more wealthy. In recent years, the international community has attempted to thwart Iran's nuclear ambitions. There was a nuclear arms that was reached. Many times, the Iranian government has said, "We are not trying to get uranium to build nuclear weapons. We are trying to get uranium for power and industry." And the world kind of looks at Iran and goes, "Well, you're one of the wealthiest oil countries in the world. Why do you need uranium for that?" And there was a agreement that was reached. It has more recently been kind of thrown out the window during the Trump administration. Um, and you can see it here. Iran's nuclear energy program began in the 1950s with U.S. financial and technological aid, because obviously the Shah in Iran was a loyal, supporter of the United States. So therefore, the United States would have allowed him to continue to do those things. Once that government changed, the United States obviously shifted their mind. And if you take a look at this image, it says, of course, our nuclear facilities are for peaceful purposes. Why do you ask? But you can see that his nose is growing like Pinocchio, death to America and to Israel. So one of the deals was that Iran must cut uranium supplies by 98% for the next 15 years. International inspectors would be allowed to monitor the Iranian nuclear research and facilities, and many of the world's economic sanctions against Iran have been lifted. So take a look at these two documents. So this is a good CRQ practice for this, and this could be a more difficult CRQ because you have to take a look really at this first document, which is the Khomeini arrives in Tehran, urges ouster of foreigners, millions rally to greet him. So when you're talking about the historical circumstance that led to the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's return from exile in 1979, you want to think about the government of the Shah. You want to be thinking and about explaining what did the Shah do. You want to be talking about westernization. You want to be talking about the desire for Iran to go back to their Islamic roots. You want to talk about anything that leads up to the Khomeini coming back and the Shah being removed. In the next document, you want to think about the point of view concerning Iranian laws. So you want to be thinking about what does he believe about the Iranian laws? What does he think about them? And this type of CRQ question would more than likely be your first step, which would be a cause and effect. So we'll explain a cause and effect relationship between historical developments, documents 1 and 2. So if you go back, you would obviously hopefully realize that document 1 is the cause and document 2 is the effect. More often than not, that's how the documents are going to be set up in the cause and effect. Doc 1 is a cause, doc 2 is the effect. And here you have your success criteria for the day. Make sure you understand these aspects. I really would take a look at this for today because I really want to make sure you know and understand this revolution. And you do have a homework for tonight where you will have an article where he talks about the Iranian Revolution, gives you more background information. Please make sure you are reading it. And he also states revolutions, Islamic and otherwise, seldom deliver on all of their promises, and a clear external enemy can serve as a useful diversion from international problems. So, what he's trying to say here is they're able to look at it and say, we can focus on something that's outside as a way to divert from the inside issues that we have ourselves. So, what you're being asked to do is to identify one other revolution from your study of history that supports Cohen's claim and explain how it's an example. So, you want to choose something besides the Iranian Revolution, and you want to take a look at this and say, what other revolution happened where they did not deliver on the promises that were set into motion, where they chose an external enemy to divert them from the internal issues that they were having? I want you to think French Revolution, Russian Revolution. I want you to think about it, independence movement. I want you to think about any, type of revolution. It doesn't always have to be political, where you kind of see where the promises that they were, things that people were promised did not happen. And whoever was in charge was able to point out an external enemy, an issue, and say, let's focus on how we need to get rid of this so that we can be more successful. If you ladies have any questions, please join the Google Meets. I am going to do a special Google Meet just on this topic where I actually review this topic again with you guys just to make sure you do understand it. If you have questions and you don't make it to the Google Meet, I'm hoping to record it so that it can be posted in classrooms so that you have two opportunities to learn this material. But if you still are looking at this, still don't understand the questions, don't make it to the Google Meet, watch that, but still don't understand what's going on, please, please, please reach out to me so that I can explain this to you. Ladies, I hope you are staying